Welcome back to the course Infrastructure Asset Management. This course is offered under MOOCs, an initiative of Government of India. My name is Chirag Kothari. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at IIT Kanpur. In this week, we will be discussing about Infrastructure Asset Management Framework and the role of data. This lecture will be focusing on generic infrastructure asset management processes. Till now, in this course, we have seen what are infrastructure assets. We also talked about life cycle of an asset. We saw that civil infrastructure assets have a long life. We also saw that for any infrastructure, there are multiple stakeholders that are involved, right from the owner, the user, and so on. Then we saw that the performance of an asset deteriorates with time. We saw that as the infrastructure starts to age, the performance goes down, and thus it is important that we maintain our assets to preserve them. So, till now we have a brief understanding of some of these principles. Now, we will see how these principles come together into a generic process. So, in this week, I will start with a generic infrastructure management process. How does it look like? When I say generic, it means that it can be applied to any infrastructure. Then we will see what is the role of data in infrastructure asset management. I will also talk about data requirements and what are the different ways of dividing the data. What are the different categories of data? Then we will discuss prioritization of data. We will discuss that data collection is a costly affair, so it is important that we prioritize what data will get collected. Then we will discuss some aspects of how to handle missing data. Here we will try to acknowledge that it is difficult to get 100% accurate data at all times. So we will discuss some techniques for handling missing data. And finally, I will talk about role and importance of qualitative data. So this is the agenda for this week. Now, in this particular lecture, I will be discussing the decision process for infrastructure systems. I will talk about the generic process, the role of data. We will discuss the categories of data, and we will discuss some of the performance measures and what are the attributes of a good measure. Now, let us dive deeper into the decision process. Decision process for infrastructure systems. Here, first we will discuss what is a decision process, and then we will see how it can be extended for any infrastructure. A decision process looks something like this. We start with a real world problem. In case of infrastructure asset, the real world problem is that the assets deteriorate with time and we need to maintain and rehabilitate them efficiently. Then we basically try to collect relevant data and information to understand the problem. So here, if we are talking about infrastructure asset maintenance, we will talk about data regarding what is the current condition of the assets and who are the users using it, and so on. This is the data which is for the past, but then we also need to make prediction for the future. So that is where the third step comes into picture, where we will try to create a model which mimics the real system. We understand that performance will vary with time. Now, we try to create a system which can mimic the real system. So this is where we try to create different performance models. Then once this is done, we try to predict, okay, what will be the future condition of this asset. We try to use this asset to understand what are the different alternatives or solutions which can be undertaken. So any typical decision process would look something like this, where you start with defining the problem, then you collect relevant data and information to understand the problem better, and then we try to the performance of an asset. We try to mimic the system with the help of this system which we develop, we try to predict the relevant data and information which will be used for determining relevant decision alternatives. This is a typical decision process. Now, in the context of infrastructure, it will look something like this. You will start with data collection. Data collection refers to collecting all the relevant data for an infrastructure. For example, if we talk about roads, we could start with collecting an inventory of all the roads which are available. Then we will talk about the lengths of these roads, their current condition, the traffic on these roads, and also try to understand what are the weather conditions. All this is part of data collection. Then we try to move to the next stage where we do performance modeling. In case of performance modeling, we try to predict how the performance will change with time. In the previous lectures, we saw that typically for any infrastructure, if I have time on the x-axis and performance on the y-axis, the performance goes down with time. Now, in case of performance modeling, we try to mimic this particular curve. We try to develop an understanding of how performance is varying with time. Then the next step is to develop alternatives. Alternative means what are the different options that we can take to preserve the asset. So, it includes all different types of maintenance that can be done. One of the alternative could be to do nothing, or in case of roads, we could say that we will do preventive maintenance. We might consider resurfacing. In some context, we could say we will do major rehabilitation or we will do reconstruction. So, there are multiple alternatives which can be done. Now, the goal of decision making here is to choose the right alternative. So, based on the data which is collected and the performance modeled, we try to develop different alternatives, and then we go to the stage of decision making. In case of decision making, we try to take a decision that out of the alternatives which are developed, which alternative should I undertake? Decision making is governed by several aspects. One of them is the relevant policies under which we have to work. Then there are the relevant goals. We might have a goal that we want to make all our assets safe. So, now we try to take a decision so that we achieve this particular goal, and we need to take this decision keeping in mind the budget we have. So, budget will also determine the type of maintenance we do. It is also a function of how many assets we have, how much money do we have, and so on. So, in case of decision making, the idea is that if there are 5 alternatives A1, A2 till A5, each of these alternatives will have different impact on the infrastructure, and as part of decision making, we try to take a call that which alternative would make sense. So, after decision making process, we will know what is the exact alternative which should be carried out. Then we try to implement it. Implementation is nothing but construction or maintenance in our case. Now, once we implement an alternative, we have to do another important aspect which is around monitoring. In case of monitoring, we try to understand what is the actual performance. It is important to note that any performance modeling which we do as part of the second step here is just a prediction. We are making an educated guess, but in real world things vary. There will be deviations. Thus, it is important to monitor progress with time. So, once you have done maintenance, you want to monitor the performance of the asset, and we try to feed this information back as part of the performance modeling. So, the idea is with time we will have a lot of information, and this information can be used to improve the performance model which we have developed. So, I have discussed the generic infrastructure asset management process. In upcoming weeks, we will discuss this entire process in detail. This week, the focus is on data collection. I will be discussing different aspects of data collection in this week. Data plays an important role in infrastructure asset management. Role of data is critical as far as infrastructure decision making is concerned. Data helps us in understanding the decision process and also implementing it effectively. Here, the idea is that as an organization or as a nation, we will have some vision. This is more of a long-term strategy. Then we will have some mission, that is, we will try to understand short-term goals, objectives and the current focus of the organization, and we want to ensure that the mission is aligned with the vision. Based on mission, we try to understand specific goals, short-term and long-term goals. These goals are used to determine the different objectives. This is where we clearly state that following objectives need to be fulfilled. Now, we need a measure to assess whether we have achieved these objectives or not. So, we come to measures. Here, we try to ensure that the measures we have can be used to understand whether we have fulfilled our objectives. Finally, based on the measures, we come to data. We try to collect relevant data which can be used to predict this particular measure or to calculate this particular measure. Please note, this is a cyclic process where if we start from the vision, our vision is helping us understand what data should be collected. However, when we really try to collect the data, this process gets reversed. We start with collecting data, then we use this data to make some calculations to understand measures. Then we see whether these measures are good enough and have we met the objectives. These objectives help us in understanding have we achieved our goals, and finally, we try to check whether we are aligned with our vision as well as mission. So, data is a critical component in achieving our vision, and our vision or use case should always drive what data needs to be collected. Now, as far as data is concerned, there are several aspects to what data needs to be collected. I will be talking about them in the subsequent lectures. But since we have already talked about performance, let us understand what will be a performance measure. How do you define a good measure? Since there are several ways to collect or talk about performance, we need to choose a measure which is good. Now, the question is, what is good? So, let us discuss different aspects of measures. What are some of the attributes of a good measure for performance? Here, we want that any measure which we use for assessing performance should be measurable. That is very simple, but the idea is it should be well defined and specific. It should be hard to dispute. It should be easy to obtain or should be readily available. It should be quantifiable. For example, we cannot just say that the infrastructure should be in good condition. What is good? What is the definition of good? How do you define good? We need to ask all these questions to ensure that we choose a measure which is measurable. Then, after measurability, we want to ensure that the measure we have is reliable. It should be consistent in measurement. If different individuals try to assess the same measure, they should get the same answer. Also, the measure should stay consistent across periods of collection. It should not change based on the weather or the environmental conditions. The idea is it should be consistent in different settings. Now, in addition to measurability and reliability, we also want the measure should be accurate. It should measure what it is asked to. It should report the right information. Also, if a measure is checked again or validated, it should give the same response. It again links with the aspect of reliability. So, a good performance measure should be reliable, accurate and something which can be measured easily. In addition to these three aspects, there are two more aspects. The first one is robustness. If there are any variables which induce errors, then the measure should be robust against them. But at the same time, we want the measure should be flexible. So, robustness is preferred as long as the measure is robust against factors which are inducing errors. But the measure which we have should be able to capture the critical variability. We cannot have a measure which is robust against any variability. If that is the case, then we are not collecting the right information, because what you are saying is that I have a measure which is so robust that it will not change with any deviations or any variations. That is not a good measure. We want something which is robust against errors or any other factors which are not directly related to what we are measuring, but at the same time it is sensitive to the factors which are under consideration. Finally, in addition to robustness, we want that measures should be complete. We understand that a single measure cannot be complete. It will be always a group of measures. These measures should be sufficient enough to define systems input, the process as well as the performance. So, as far as attributes of a good measure are concerned, we want something which is accurate, measurable, robust as well as complete. Now, in some of the next lectures, we will discuss what are the different performance measures and how performance measure change with time. Measuring performance is just one part of the problem. Let us briefly discuss what are the different types of data that needs to be collected for infrastructure management. Here we start with understanding the organization's focus. So, we try to collect all the relevant data which helps us in understanding what is the focus. So, the mission as well as the vision comes here. Then we collect relevant data to understand the current condition of the asset. Once we have the current condition of the asset, we want to mimic the system. We want to predict future performance. To do that, we create a model, but the model will have some assumptions. We need to collect relevant data to understand those assumptions. We also need to understand what are the different maintenance techniques available. We need to collect data around it. We need to collect the cost associated with it. We also need to collect data on what is the budget available. Then we also need to understand the asset's performance, how it is varying with time and the total cost. So, there are different aspects to data. We need to collect all these data in detail. Only then we can move towards the process of decision making. In the next lecture, we will discuss each of these aspects in detail. For now, I will end this lecture here. As you recall, in this lecture, we have discussed a basic decision making process. We have also talked about the infrastructure management process, a generic process, and the role of data. We have also talked about different attributes of a good measure. Now, students are encouraged to go over these references if you want to learn about this particular topic. Now, with that, I will conclude this lecture here. Thank you. Thanks for listening.